if we were to move to a plant-rich diet, the carbon savings and the climate smartness of that change in our food system, again, is equivalent to roughly, based on the models, a threefold increase in carbon capture over any adjustments that we make to agroecological practices in the field. That's not to say that what we do on the farm doesn't matter. It matters enormously, but it is important that we see the breadth and the magnitude of the challenge and the things that are going to really matter. And certainly when it comes to agroecological practices in the field, it's going to be the foundational change in the cropping system that will drive all else.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label distinguishing organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. We're continuing our conversation today with Dr. David Mortensen, former National Organic Standards Board member and head of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Food Systems Department at the University of New Hampshire. Today we'll hear about Dave's time on the NOSB as one of the board members who opposed the organic certification of hydroponic crops back in 2017. He'll also share his thoughts on the rise of corporate regenerative agriculture.
As I said, I met you when you were serving on the National Organic Standards Board. You were the scientist representative at the time. And I was going, probably for your whole tenure, I was attending the NOSB meetings. I started just about the same time you did. There were people who'd been attending these things, trying to represent real organic. We didn't have the term, but they were trying to represent organic as the movement intended it to be. And actually they were steadily losing, and really starting in 2010, which is starting with Tom Vilsack. And I don't mean that he was the worst of the secretaries of agriculture, but I think we started to lose then because organic started to actually mean something in the marketplace then. And as it continued to grow in the marketplace, then people coming in and wanting to take advantage of that market also grew, and their influence grew, and it started to be a real battle. And I think that was, the OTA looked back at in 2020 and said for the last 10 years, not a single recommendation of the NOSB has been acted on and put into rulemaking by the National Organic Program. Well, that's 10 years. That was 20 decisions that you all made. And not one of those decisions, I know how much work you all put into that, not one of those decisions was acted on. And probably the very first of those to not be acted on was to prohibit hydroponic from being certified as organic back in 2010. So could you just talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you coming into the National Organic Standards Board as, you know, I assume hopeful, as a hopeful person hoping to make a change?
I did come in hopeful. I came in admittedly naive about the National Organic Standards Board and the National Organic Program, not completely unknowing, but naive about the way that it functioned and the extent to which the recommendations from the board resulted in change. Naive because I did see actually where I was before the National Organic Standards Board. All of my work in DC and in the policy space, most of it was on this reducing pesticides and pushing back on GMOs and I was certainly conducting research in organic. We eat organic at our house. I teach about it and all of that, but I had really gotten deep into the policy space on the trying to make conventional agriculture more ecologically sound. And what I found disillusioning early on was that the board would set or not just make policy recommendations, but would actually do the analysis on and write up what the change should look like. So that's not just making a recommendation, we should change something, right? That's one thing, and a lot of us could recommend to change things. But for people to take a year or 2 years or 5 years to write a document that is very thoughtfully crafted and where panel sessions, multiple ones over years of time, are convened to inform and clarify what the issues are. What are the paths to resolve those issues? What are the impacts of taking those paths? And then not to have those recommendations acted upon was something I had never seen before, actually. Because I had seen how the recommendations in commodity crop production were acted upon. They just were acted upon in a way that I didn't agree, but they were acted upon. These just would sit there, and you would find yourself wondering, gosh, what are we actually accomplishing here with this when they're not being acted upon and taken seriously? Hydroponics being one, the livestock rule that we spent so much time on being another. So that's a really unfortunate disconnect that exists between the work of the National Organic Standards Board and the work of the National Organic Program. And honestly, and from what I've seen of commodity crop production and decision making and the interface between the board and NOP, it actually shares many of the same qualities that I observed of USDA and EPA's unwillingness to really think about the solution set, as the Europeans talk about solution sets, and they have this way of analyzing, if we take this solution set or that solution set, ways that we set policy. What are the factors? What are we going to change? And how do they interact? That's the solution set. That we're not looking at the full set of solutions and then taking action that's going to be action in the best interest of the environment and agroecological farming.
Yeah, I became convinced that we weren't going to get reform that we had hoped for. It appeared to be a policy entirely guided by large corporate interests, and I just couldn't see any way that we, the organic movement, were going to persuade the National Organic Program that really they should follow the law as it was commonly understood. And it was interesting. Of course, Jacksonville, Florida was the big meeting where the NSB actually didn't vote to support the organic movement. You did, and that was a reversal from 7 years earlier, where it was 14-1, saying hydroponics should not be permitted, and now it was 8-7, essentially saying it should be. That wasn't technically what the vote was, but that was certainly the message, and it was the message to the members of the board as well. And I know that the board it was interesting. So that board was entirely chosen by Tom Vilsack. You know, he had been Secretary of Ag for 7 years at that point. It's a 5-year term. And so those were his folks. And, you know, people have told me that the board had changed considerably. There were always still people like you and Emily Oakley and Francis Tickey, but it used to be that everybody was like you guys, that they really were organic advocates, and they really were people who understand organic and you know, were part of a movement. And it's become much more corporate since then. And I saw a group of people who were very confused about what we were even talking about. When they gave their reasons for why they were voting, the people who voted against that proposal had the most outlandish reasons.
Yeah, it was. As I said, I was naive. I didn't go back to study, you know, exactly when I came on the board, but this was either the first meeting or maybe it was the second. But I didn't appreciate, because it seemed so obvious to me that there was nothing about hydroponic production that fit into the Organic Food Production Act. That it just didn't even occur to me. Yeah, it was it's not allowed in Europe. It's not allowed in Japan. It's not allowed in Canada. I was quite naive, actually, though it was clear as we got closer, you know, the 4 or 6 months leading up to that Jacksonville meeting, it was very clear that my more senior colleagues, Francis in particular, was saying, you know, we really have got to be sure we have our A game, you know, go into that meeting in Jacksonville, because there are some people on the board that are gonna vote in favor of hydroponic being allowed. And then we would start having these meetings where we were, the whole board, where you were hearing things like board members saying, and then I realized just like how, you know, this is more problematic than I realized. Like where 2 members said during discussions with the group, if it as long as it doesn't have GMOs and synthetic pesticides, I'm good with it. That was the view of 2 members of the. You had this other view that you know, we needed to make organic available to as many people as possible, and who are we to you know, be the gatekeeper of access to organic, and that if we open up the gates to the methods of production, the price would come down and more people. It was a food justice issue, which I also take great issue with, and we discussed and debated that.
It's the same reasoning for why you should allow all that chemistry in
So
agriculture
it's
in the first place.
it's exactly the same argument. It's exactly the same argument, and why we need it, and you know, and yeah. So it was shocking, you know, to see how things went down there. Like, because the reason I got on the board is that several farmer friends of mine had, you know, asked me, would you be willing to do this? And I said, well, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to be on there, but I certainly, you know, I know a lot about the subject, and I certainly support you guys, you know. But Mike and Tara Brombeck, the Brubaker family, and others, you know, Jim Crawford, were folks that had been such kind, participatory farmers in the work we did together, had opened their places up for my classes, had counseled me on things that they were concerned about in organic agriculture that needed attention, and needed to get the university on the ball with that. I got very involved with Rodale So to go from that perspective and then be sitting there, having folks argue that, pretty much anything would go in hydroponics was sort of stunning. And since then, I've actually had the opportunity to get into and see or read about, visit places, where that spans the range, and it certainly could be certified organic if they altered their nutrient source. But places where the plant and the seed are never touched by human hands. Can you imagine that? A vegetable system where no human, and this is part of the allure of it,
right,
from a marketing point of view, so there could be no, foreign microbes on the leafy greens, et cetera, but where there's no contact with a human. That is a worrying dystopian sort of thought about the future. So,
and in fact, no contact with soil either.
And certainly no contact with soil. I mean, that goes without saying, right? But the idea that it could no contact with soil and no contact with humans, that's anyway. So and so it just goes against, when we were starting out the conversation on, how do you think about agroecology? You take a terrestrial plant out of its environment, which is the soil, which is what it's evolved to grow in, with these deeply complex feedback systems and ways in which the roots communicate with the soil, and the microbiome, this myriad of fungi and bacteria and algae in the soil. And they're talking to one another, and the plant is growing, and the nutrients are being taken up because the microbiome is working in concert with the rhizosphere of these plants. And for us to think that plopping a plant into a nutrient solution or spraying a nutrient solution on a rhizosphere is the same thing, is so deeply fleshlight science and so arrogant of us, that we would think that is in the long term best interest of human wellness, and certainly to think that it's in the long-term interests of this multifunctional ecosystem services way of thinking about agriculture is a fool's errand. I said once when we were discussing this, I just find it's easy to get caught up in things that we lose sight of the big picture, on this subject of what is this hydroponic system that we're looking at. Here the board could get lost in discussing how much of a biofilm can be comprised of, a fossil fuel derived, compound versus all natural bio-based materials in the film. And I would sit there and be scratching my head and thinking, we're going to scrutinize. Now, I'm not a proponent of lots of plastic in agriculture, but we're going to scrutinize the biochemical makeup of a plastic film over a tiny fraction of the field, and we're not going to ask questions about the Tygon tubing, the styrofoam floating trays, the Teflon this and Tyvek that, where the plants are actually not grown in anything natural. it's all synthetic materials is mind-boggling to me. It's so incongruous, and so there's a real problem with science. Some science people call it a sensitivity analysis, like focus on the stuff that has the big impact and then focus on the stuff that has the small impact later. The idea that we are not seeing the big impact of hydroponic is that it's an entirely synthetic system made up of a myriad of synthetic things, devoid of any coupling with ecological processes, and then we get lost on some smaller thing, is a problem that I think is inherent with maybe with wicked problems that people think are too big to solve, and so you focus on the little ones. But I found myself feeling often that we were having this struggle where we would focus on the little things. And to me, the sunset list is the little stuff. Like I'd much rather see technical people spend more time and let the board work on some of the bigger stuff. But that's not to demean the importance of the sunset list. But we were just spending. There's so much to do. Yeah. You've got to figure out how you're going to devote your time in a way that it's being devoted to things that matter more than other things.
Yeah. It seems like they've completely actually blocked the board from even looking at the big things.
Yeah.
So thank you for giving me a little bit of your vision, sitting on the board of what was going on, and something that we all struggle with. Out of that decision, of course, was born the Real Organic Project. And in fact, all the farmers you mentioned who guided you to be on that board are part of the Real Organic Project. And they're have actually all part of our pilot farms, our very first 65 farms that joined. And the Real Organic Project is just what it says. We're trying to talk about real organic, and that's not done with contempt or arrogance. It's really what do we mean by organic? What does the world mean? What have we always meant? It's not change. I think the things that you described, David, are in fact the work that remains to be done, which is infinite. And when you talk about studying systems and seeing, well, how do we optimize or make those systems work better, that's the real work that needs to be done, not figuring out how to use Tygon tubing for whatever, all of that. Let's tie the two conversations together, the struggle for real organic and the effort to the attempt to make conventional more ecologically sound, which is, I think, what the regenerative movement started as. And, our symposium is really looking at, well, is regenerative organic? And we're pretty sure that regenerative, as it is now being portrayed in the popular culture, is not organic. And I sent you a list, but I'll read through it just quickly, of the major players from big ag and big food who now very, very vocally promote regenerative agriculture, and it's a chilling list. Cargill, Bayer, Monsanto, Syngenta, Bunge, ADM, Pepsi, McDonald's, General Mills, Walmart, Nestle, Purdue, Hormel, Corteva, Mars, and Land O'Lakes. And I'm just curious, I just listed most of the companies that actually control our food system and that define conventional agriculture. And now they're all saying, we're regenerative.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that?
Yeah, there's this big movement over the last 15 or 20 years that I've seen in life in general, and that is that we've really gotten amped up about branding. What's your brand? I get the sense that it's very important in marketing that your brand reflects something that you want your clientele to see in you. There is an interest that I believe is genuine and as informed as it can be in a food system that is largely decoupled from where the production is decoupled from the people. So I believe that many consumers are very interested in the environment. They're very interested in how their food was raised, how the workers that raised the food were treated, how the environment is being improved as a result of those practices. There's a lot of skepticism about this on the NOSB and in larger circles than that. Certainly at the USDA there is this notion that, folks, they don't know the difference, they don't care. Why are you so worried about the GMO thing? Do you think they really care about the herbicide link and all of that? And I actually do think they care. I just think that we don't do as good a job as we could educating the public about things that they're decoupled from. So how could you care about something if you don't know a lot about something? The folks that know a lot about organic are very concerned about how food is grown, how workers are treated, the impact of those practices on the environment. And so I think from a branding point of view, these companies, like the ones on that list that you read off, know that this has to be part of their brand. We are all for the environment. We care about, the way things are produced. And I think these are claims that companies make, like these companies. I don't think all companies do this, because really what I'm saying is I think it's misleading claims about something that they're really not paying attention to. How could a large grain corporation, grain handling and sales corporation, or a company that has been working for the past 25 years on breeding crops to use herbicides and use greater amounts of herbicides in the environment, claim that that's regenerative? How could someone honestly argue that a practice that they are responsible for having created and marketed that results in an increase in 70% increase in herbicide use and 16-fold increase in the use of dicamba, that you can pin back to specific companies that are on your list? How could you claim honestly that that's regenerative and that you're concerned about the environment? So I think it's misleading, and I think what we need to be doing is doing a much better job of helping people unpack where is the truth in things that are being claimed. Where is the truth in things that are emblazoned with a logo, like organic, the organic label, in a way that helps people understand, that if these are blueberries from the Southwest desert of the United States with this label on them, with this company's tag on them, Those are blueberries that are grown out of their own environment in a manner in which is completely at odds with the intent of organic production. So I think there's a real problem there. There's a real problem where the branding and the claims that are being made are not honest, and they also, for the consumer, are difficult to sort through because they don't have the information they need to make better decisions. I think all too often that's happening.
Great, thank you. Well, let me tie it one last step then, which is tremendous amount of conversation right now about climate change. COP is going on right now. USDA just gave away $2.8 billion, $2.7 billion of our money, which is wonderful, to try and address issues of climate in agriculture. They call it climate smart agriculture.
Yeah.
Most of that money went to the people on this list.
Yeah.
So climate smart agriculture is, the champions of this appear to be Bayer, Monsanto, and Syngenta and Cargill. These same companies that, in my mind, have created the problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are we to do with that? I mean, do you think that they're going to change? That getting, 80 or 90 million dollars from USDA, that there are going to be some radical new experiments going on to really stop using all the pesticides? One of the great claims going on, and this is great because you're essentially a plant ecologist, is that all of these companies are championing no-till, and that no-till is better for the climate because it's not creating such rapid oxidation of organic matter from the soil. Have you thought about this at all?
Yeah, I have thought about this a lot. Early on, I had a very wise, more senior person tell me, Dave, do what you can to address the bigger question, the foundational question that is driving much of the system, rather than tweaking dials for much of your career. These very thoughtful words from this person who had spent 35 years, and I was just kind of on the early end of getting started. And I'm sure I tweaked some dials along the way, but it's very important to look at the foundational sort of conditions that really drive much else. If you're just going to focus up sort of on the bits above the foundation, the likelihood that you're going to change anything of substance is very small. The problem with investing a lot of money, and this was a lot of money, I had the opportunity to chair for 3 or 4 different years. I chaired competitive grant programs in DC where we gave out amounts of money, and in those days, like, we got a panel and we're gonna give out $3 million. Well, that sounded like a lot, but really, when you spread that out across the entire United States, that's not much. This program was $55 million to this one, $98 million to that one. These were big awards that were being given to drive things. And much of that list that you've read off, Dave, is basically the commodity crop, largely Midwestern scene that drives the 160 million acres of corn and soybean. The foundational problem that we have is a grossly oversimplified agriculture with one or two crops. And we've tried to manipulate pest populations and fertility and, soil preservation and conservation in a system like that, where the magnitude of response is highly constrained. We can do a little better with nitrogen. We can do a good bit better with pesticide use if we made the right decisions, which we haven't been making. But what the problem really begs is a systems scale foundational change to agriculture that really much of that is outlined in the Organic Food Production Act, interestingly. Rotations of crops, the use of cover crops on most farmed acres. The Midwest is running at a whopping 2 or 3% cover crop adoption after investing federal funds for the last 20 years in driving cover crop use up in the Midwest as a carbon sequestration practice and a soil erosion control practice. It's gone up maybe 0.5% in 20 years. If we're not, and if we're going to say we want to do climate smart agriculture, you start with the rotations. You start with some degree of perenniality in the agriculture system. Grasses, forages, hay fields. You start with field edges that are not seen as something to increasingly constrain and do away with, but actually nurturing the field edges, a practice again that's outlined in the Organic Food Production Act, cover cropping, rotation, incorporation of perennials in agriculture, disallowing the use of pesticides. All of a sudden, the pest cycles are, the management of that is on the backs of rotation. The management of that is on the backs of, creative indigenous knowledge by the farmer, knowing which fields have which problems and which ones they're gonna, strategically plan to do certain things to address a pest problem through a systems level solution. So when I see that money being used in that way, what unfortunately it tells me is that we are investing in a way to reinforce what is the corn soybean model and much of that acreage, and where we will have and I give credit to folks, the farmers and the researchers that will work together, agencies that will work together to try to move the needle, for example, on cover crops. But the truth is that that's been something that folks have been working on for the last 20 years, and in the last 10 or 15 with a concerted effort. Cover crop councils across the Midwest, cover crop councils across the Northeast, and we're not seeing the adoption to this. We wrote a paper on the state-by-state adoption of cover cropping that was in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation, and it's pathetic. And we really need bolder steps taken that lean into the ecological practices that are organic agriculture. I think if we had more farms being farmed organically, and they could serve as role models for folks doing conventional farming, and they would be able to see, gosh, they are using cover crops, and nobody else is using them around here, so maybe actually that could work. That to me would be a much better investment of those dollars. I think another thing that, that's we sometimes miss, and I did a little bit of reading about this before coming up, Dave, that I just wanted to point out, because I think it is something that we sometimes miss. The agroecological practices are profoundly important, and I really do believe that they're laid out and have been practiced by organic farmers for all the while that we've called it organic farming. Those practices that I was rattling off and many others. But we're also, when we think about a climate smart agriculture, I think we want to take a step back and talk about a climate smart food system. Reducing food waste as an initiative that is worthy of a great deal of attention. And by a number of models that have looked at this, reducing food waste is the top food-related would be, if we were looking at this, doing the sensitivity analysis, you would start there. There's 3 times as much carbon to be gained in reducing food waste than any other agricultural adjustment that we'd make. And I'm arguing here that the foundation is cropping systems, crop diversity, and all of that. But even before we get to that, we would start with food waste. We would also be debating and discussing and thinking hard about the diet that we consume. If we were to move to a plant-rich diet, the carbon savings and the climate smartness of that change in our food system, again, is equivalent to roughly, based on the models, a 3-fold increase in carbon capture over any adjustments that we make to agroecological practices in the field. That's not to say that what we do on the farm doesn't matter. It matters enormously, but it is important that we see the breadth and the magnitude of the challenge and the things that are going to really matter. And certainly when it comes to agroecological practices in the field, it's going to be the foundational change in the cropping system that will drive all else. And if we're not going to make that foundational change at the foundational level, and we're going to spend a lot of money reinforcing the current system that's in place, the opportunities for any adjustments in climate friendliness of those practices is going to be very, very small.
All right. That's great, David. All right. That's right. There's a thing I have written on the wall of my office, which is, it's like a story of a guy's out on his hands and knees under a street light, and a friend comes along and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm looking for my keys. I lost the keys to my car." And the guy gets down and is looking with them. "I can't find them." He says, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" And he says, No, I dropped them over there in the bushes, but the light's much better here." And there it is. Are we looking for where we dropped the keys?
Yeah.
Or just where we think it would be easy to find them?
Yeah. Or I have a plaque in my office, and I don't speak Danish. I only fumble through certain things, but it's one of these Royal Copenhagen, very pretty white plaque in blue ink, hand done, and it's this person crawling around on the ground, not looking for keys, but is caught up in looking at all of these small stones with this very large stone off to the side, and it's the same point. It loosely translated, it's they who let the small things bind them leave the great undone behind them. And I would say that that this focus and fixation on commodity crop entrenchment of what we are doing right now is going to have a very small payback.
I know we should end soon. It's been a very long interview, which I really appreciate. It's great. Can I just ask for organic farmers who are tilling and they're incorporating green manures with it, and actually they're seeing their soil organic matter going up, do you see that as a problem for climate? Because the claim of the no-till movement is that any tillage of the soil borders on sin. It's become a moral message.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have a habit of not answering your questions directly. I did a fair amount of looking into this issue of no-till is so much better, and it's this pristine system that we, for 20 or 30 or 40 years the field goes untilled, and you build up this organic matter layer at the surface, and the soil aggregate stability and all these things improve so much better when we do it that way. The sad reality is that a lot of that is not representative of what goes on the ground in the fields and farmers' places. And honestly, I think the lack of that claim, the claim that organic is the way forward and permanent organic is the way forward over what farmers are doing, is an example of where we're not getting out in the fields on farmers' places and asking them, why are you doing it the way you're doing it? It turns out that the more common practice where no-till is practiced is that no-till is practiced, and it's rotational no-till. This is conventional ag now. I'm not talking about organic ag. Rotational tillage is an interest of organic farmers too. But this notion that we never till the field, certainly there are fields that are never tilled, but it's a small percentage of the no-till fields. In Minnesota, for example, the frequency of breaking a field back out after no-till is about 2.2, 2.3 years. 2 years in no-till, 1 year out of no-till, 2 years in no-till, et cetera, depending on whether it's corn or soybean that's going back in. So the reality on the ground is that farmers see a benefit to not having the fields be perennially no-till. That has to do with such things as pest problem buildup. It has to do with such things as soil hardness, and where root penetration is a problem for certain crops. It has to do with how they get the fertility in the ground if they're not cover cropping, because they're applying something and that has to get into the ground somehow. And they're concerned about the pH of the soils, and that has to be addressed somehow. So that's the reality on the ground, and we took a pretty careful look at this in a paper that we published several years ago. But I would also say that strict no-till proponents haven't looked at holistically at what an organic practice is and what an organic farm represents. If you're working in the Midwest, where a typical field size is 200 or 400 acres, and there's no field edge anywhere until you get out to the edge of that, and we actually mapped the field edges of all 750 Midwestern counties in a GIS analysis where we were looking at the effects of those field edges on the potential for pollination support for crops across all of the Midwest. In an organic farm, you've got lots of edges, lots and lots of edges. So when we think about something no-till, and we think about, okay, no-till, and then soybean no-till, no-till, and corn no-till, in an organic farm, it's more likely to be something like 12 crops and an order of magnitude or two more field edges or uncropped cover on the farmstead. That's all part of the carbon capture that's going on for that parcel of ground. So you've got the things going on in the fields, but you have also the things that are going on in the field edges and in the uncropped areas. Once we get down to the field level, it's still the case that quite a few people haven't fully wrapped their heads around the fact that deep burial of organic matter through tillage of cover crops and other crop residues, but in an organic farming system, deep burial of, meaning plowing it or incorporating it with some sort of a disc or something, is something that results in the carbon being preserved deep in the profile in a way that you obviously don't have deep burial and no-till of organic matter. So if you look at the organic matter profile of a no-till field, it's very high at the top, and it attenuates very strongly as you go into the profile. In many organic fields, and this has been studied fairly widely, you will see a more uniform organic matter profile in the top worked depth of the soil, maybe 12 inches or so, or 15 inches of the soil. And the deeper the carbon is placed, the lower the turnover rate of the carbon that's been placed deep. So the net effect of all of that at the field level where the crop is being planted, and that's outside of the edges and the non-cropped areas and things that I was mentioning, it's also outside of the perennial cover, grasses, forages, etc., that are commonly a part of a rotation in an organic farm. You have equivalent or greater amounts of carbon being buried in those fields with those practices. Now, is that to say that organic farmers aren't concerned? I mean, are they content to go with the kind of tillage intensity that is typically used in an annual cropped field, on an organic farm? It is the case that there is a lot of interest on the part of organic farmers, and in fact, many of the participatory things we were doing and many other people are doing, where the farmers are working with folks that are doing these coordinated trials, are looking at different methods of reducing the intensity of tillage so as to increase, so as to reduce the impact of tillage on driving carbon turnover rates in the soil. So I'm saying deep burial protects it, but there is no question that a lot of churning of the soil at the surface is something that we're working to try to reduce. And most organic farmers are all in on trying to reduce the intensity of that stirring of the soil at the surface. So I think that when you taken together at the farm scale, you've got a heightened level of crop diversity, so that you've got carbon capture going on over a broader window of the growing season. You've got most all of the annually cropped acres covered in a cover crop, where that level of cover crop adoption is in single digits in other farms with these commodity crops. And that's carbon that's going back into the soil. And then you've got the deep burial and the longer residence time of the carbon. The net effect of that taken together is that you're going to be storing more carbon on a farm that's diverse, that's got perennial cover, and that's got annual cropping, all part of the package.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great beginning. We have more. So, but I know that we got to end. So just my invitation, do you have any last words that you want to share?
So as a researcher and a teacher and a consumer of organic food, I am deeply grateful for the models of ecological integrity and sustainability that soil-based organic farmers have been for me in my work and in my life. Farmers like Mike and Tara Brownbeck Roy Brubaker, Jim Crawford, and many others have helped me see how ecological practices are used in concert to shape a truly sustainable agriculture that builds soil, that produces nutritious crops, and that does it in a way that is kind to the farmers, to the consumers, and to the environment. And I'm very deeply grateful for the lessons I've learned from those farmers. Some of us need to be reminded that our perspectives on an issue like the work that Real Organic is engaged in, some of us need to be reminded that our work and finding our voice is important to help inform us, help inform society make the right choices. When I first got on the board, Dave Chapman and Dave, you, and several others, but particularly Dave, actually said, you know, you have the podium right now. Use it. There have been times in my career where I've done better at using the podium. I think the work that Dave and the Real Organic movement, the farmers, the board members, the activists that work with Dave and his team are doing the things that are likely to move the discussion in a direction that will bring about change. It's clear sitting on the sidelines or being lost in an issue and not finding your voice does little to inform clarity around the issues and action to bring about change. And I'm very thankful for Dave's work and for the work that Real Organic is doing on this really important matter.
All right. Dave Mortensen, thank you so much for spending this afternoon with me, and we will share this with a lot of people.
Great. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you'll subscribe and share the link with your friends. Take the time today to leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to so that others can find us. A video version of this interview is found at realorganicproject.org and by following our YouTube channel. Please join us next time when our guest will be Real Organic farmer Zach Kennedy from Prima Farms just north of Reno.